The whisper of a cry. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead. All eyes were on the woman who stood shakily before the judge, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The tension in the air was palpable, each person waiting for her to speak. But the words wouldn't come, not yet. Her name was Claire Watson. She was a petite woman in her late 20s, her once vibrant auburn hair now dull and tied back in a loose ponytail. Her pale blue eyes flicked nervously between the judge and the man seated at the defense table. That man was her husband. No, her tormentor, Jeremy Watson. Jeremy had the kind of charisma that made strangers trust him instantly. Tall, with neatly combed dark hair and a confident smirk, he had a presence that could fill any room. But beneath the polished exterior lurked a man who thrived on control, a man who had turned Claire's life into a living nightmare. The room watched as Claire hesitated. Her lips parted slightly, but the words stuck in her throat. She clenched her fists, her fingernails digging into her palms, as if the pain could give her the courage she needed. The judge, an elderly man with a kind but firm demeanor, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Watson, do you wish to continue?" His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of concern. Claire's gaze drifted to the small wooden chair beside her, empty now, but once occupied by her daughter, Emily. A sob caught in her throat. Emily was the reason she was here, the reason she had to speak. Claire took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. He said I was worthless." Her voice wavered but grew stronger with each word. "That no one would believe me. But he was wrong. Someone has to believe me now." The judge nodded, motioning for her to continue. Claire's mind raced back to the night that changed everything. A night like any other. It had been a quiet evening in the Watson home. The kind of quiet that seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. Emily, just 5 years old, was drawing at the kitchen table, her golden curls glowing in the warm light of the chandelier. Claire busied herself with dishes, trying to ignore the tension that always seemed to settle over the house like a storm cloud. Jeremy sat in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes fixed on his phone. His silence was a warning sign. Claire had learned over the years that quiet moments with Jeremy were like the calm before a hurricane. She scrubbed the plate in her hand harder, as if the motion could erase the dread building in her chest. "Mommy," Emily's sweet voice broke through Claire's thoughts. "Can you look at my drawing?" Claire turned, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart." She dried her hands on a towel and walked over to the table, leaning down to admire Emily's creation. It was a colorful depiction of their family, or what Emily wished their family could be. She, Claire, and Jeremy stood together under a bright sun, all smiles. "It's beautiful, Emily," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, silently promising to protect her. But the peace shattered when Jeremy's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Claire." His tone was sharp, accusatory. "What's taking so long with dinner?" Her body tensed, and she shot Emily a reassuring smile before stepping into the living room. "It's almost ready," she said softly, hoping to diffuse his irritation. Jeremy's eyes narrowed as he set his glass down with a loud clink. "Almost ready. I've been waiting for hours." "It's only been 20 minutes," Claire said cautiously, instantly regretting her words. Jeremy stood, towering over her. "Are you calling me a liar?" His voice was low, dangerous. "No, I—" Before she could finish, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the room. Emily's scream pierced the air as Jeremy hurled his whiskey glass across the room, the shards scattering like deadly confetti. "Get out of my sight," he roared. Claire scrambled to pick up the broken pieces, her hands trembling. Emily clung to her leg, her little body shaking with fear. Claire's heart broke as she whispered, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's got you." But deep down, Claire knew she didn't have control. Not over Jeremy, not over the house, not over their lives. A frantic 911 call. That night, after Emily had finally fallen asleep, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly around her phone. Her finger hovered over the number pad. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but fear kept her frozen. Jeremy was asleep in the next room, and the thought of him waking up and finding her making a call was too terrifying to risk. She stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Then, in a moment of desperation, she dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and professional. 911. What's your emergency? Claire's voice was barely audible. Please, help. He's going to hurt us. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? The operator asked. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to the door. Yes, she whispered. Please. Before she could say more, the door creaked open. Jeremy's shadow loomed in the doorway. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who are you talking to? He demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Claire quickly ended the call, hiding the phone behind her back. No one, she stammered. I was just. Jeremy lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a crushing grip. You think I'm stupid? He hissed, his face inches from hers. The next few moments were a blur of fear and pain. Claire struggled against his grip, but Jeremy's strength was overwhelming. He yanked the phone from her hand, his face contorted with rage. You're trying to ruin me, he growled, but you'll regret it. As he stormed out of the room, Claire crumpled to the floor, her body shaking with silent sobs. In the other room, Emily stirred, her small voice calling out for her mother. Claire crawled to the doorway, her resolve hardening. She had made the call. Help was coming. She just had to hold on. A promise to protect. When the police arrived, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet street. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Officers knocked on the door, their voices firm but calm. Jeremy answered, his demeanor cool and collected. Officers, is there a problem? He asked, his tone laced with false concern. Claire stepped into the hallway, clutching Emily to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. One of the officers, Detective Anna Reed, immediately noticed the bruises on Claire's wrist and the trembling child in her arms. Ma'am, are you okay? Reed asked gently. Claire hesitated, glancing at Jeremy. He glared at her, his message clear. Don't say a word. But something inside Claire shifted. She looked down at Emily, who buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. No, Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. We're not okay. Reed nodded, her expression softening. We're here to help, she said. As the officers led Claire and Emily out of the house, Jeremy's mask of composure cracked. He shouted after them, his voice filled with venom. You'll regret this, Claire. You'll regret everything. But Claire didn't look back. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. She had taken the first step toward freedom, toward protecting Emily, and she wasn't going to stop until they were safe. Threads of hope. The police station was sterile and cold, its fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glare on everything beneath them. Claire sat in a small interview room, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee she didn't intend to drink. Across from her, Detective Anna Reed reviewed a notepad, her brows furrowed as she pieced together the fragments of Claire's hurried account. Emily sat on a small bench near the corner, clutching her stuffed bunny. Her golden curls were slightly tangled, and her big blue eyes darted between her mother and the unfamiliar room. Despite her young age, Emily seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, her usually bubbly demeanor subdued. Detective Reed looked up from her notes, her gaze softening as she addressed Claire. Mrs. Watson, I understand how difficult this must be, but we need more details to proceed. You said your husband has been abusive. Claire hesitated, her grip tightening around the cup. She glanced at Emily, who was now whispering softly to her bunny, before nodding. He's not the man everyone thinks he is, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremy can be charming, but behind closed doors, he's controlling, angry. He has a temper. Reed leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but probing. Has he physically hurt you or Emily? Claire froze, the question hanging in the air like a heavy weight. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She glanced down at the faint bruises on her wrist, barely visible but undeniable. Then her eyes drifted to Emily, who now stared at her mother with wide, questioning eyes. Yes, Claire finally admitted, her voice trembling. He's hurt me. And Emily. She swallowed hard, the confession feeling like a betrayal and a release all at once. But he always finds a way to make me doubt myself. He says it's my fault, that I provoke him. Reed's expression darkened, but her tone remained steady. And what about tonight? Can you walk me through what happened? The breaking point. Claire took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she set the cup down. Tonight was different. Emily spilled a glass of water during dinner. It wasn't a big deal, but Jeremy lost it. He yelled, threw his glass. He was out of control. I tried to calm him down, but her voice cracked, and she looked away, blinking back tears. He grabbed her, Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He grabbed her arm so hard, and she cried out. I tried to step in, but he turned on me. Told me to stay out of it, or I'd be next. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Reed nodded, her pen moving swiftly across the page. And that's when you called 911. Yes, Claire said, her voice firmer now. I knew I had to. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Reed set her pen down, her expression both professional and compassionate. Mrs. Watson, I'm going to be honest with you. From what you've described, this is a serious case of domestic abuse. We'll need to involve Child Protective Services, and there may be a lengthy legal process ahead. Are you ready for that? Claire's heart sank at the mention of CPS, but she nodded. I don't care what it takes. I just want Emily to be safe. Reed gave a small, encouraging smile. You're doing the right thing. A dark web unravels. While Claire and Emily were moved to a temporary shelter, the police began their investigation into Jeremy Watson. At first glance, Jeremy appeared to be an upstanding citizen. He was a well-respected financial consultant with a spotless record and a polished image. His neighbors described him as charming and polite, the kind of man who hosted barbecues in the summer and shoveled snow for elderly residents in the winter. But as Detective Reed and her team dug deeper, cracks began to appear in Jeremy's carefully crafted facade. Financial records revealed suspicious transactions, large sums of money withdrawn without clear explanations. There were reports of strained relationships with former colleagues, whispers of temper tantrums behind closed doors, and at least one incident where a coworker had filed a complaint against him for harassment. The complaint had been mysteriously dropped, with no explanation given. The deeper they dug, the darker the picture became. Jeremy wasn't just an angry man. He was a calculated manipulator, someone who thrived on control and intimidation, the shelter of strangers. Meanwhile, Claire and Emily settled into the shelter. The space was modest but clean, a far cry from the oppressive luxury of their home. Claire shared a room with another mother, Maria, and her two young sons. Maria was older, with kind eyes and a soothing voice that seemed to calm even the most restless of children. On their first night, Maria approached Claire as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the floor. "You're not alone, you know," Maria said gently, her accent soft and melodic. "I've been where you are." Claire looked up, surprised. "You have?" Maria nodded, her expression tinged with sadness. "I left my husband 2 years ago. He was a lot like yours. Charming on the outside, a monster on the inside. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the only way to save my boys." Claire hesitated, her voice barely audible. How do you keep going?" Maria smiled faintly, sitting beside her. "One day at a time. You focus on what matters, your daughter. And you remind yourself that every step forward, no matter how small, is a step toward freedom. The words resonated with Claire. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Jeremy's counterattack. Back at the Watson house, Jeremy was seething. The police visit had embarrassed him in front of the neighbors, and Claire's sudden disappearance had thrown his carefully controlled life into chaos. He paced the living room, his mind racing. He wasn't worried about Claire herself. She was weak, easily manipulated, but the thought of her talking to the police, of airing their private matters in public, filled him with rage. He needed to regain control. Jeremy picked up his phone and called his lawyer, a shrewd man who specialized in damage control. "I need to shut this down," Jeremy growled. "Claire's making baseless accusations, and it's going to ruin me." The lawyer's voice was calm, calculated. "We can handle this. I'll file for emergency custody of Emily and claim that Claire is unfit. We'll argue that she's been emotionally unstable and incapable of providing a safe environment." Jeremy smirked, a plan forming in his mind. He had always been able to twist the truth to his advantage. This would be no different. A mother's resolve. At the shelter, Claire received a call from Detective Reed. "Mrs. Watson, I wanted to update you. Jeremy has filed for emergency custody of Emily." Claire's blood ran cold. "What? He can't take her from me." "We're aware of his tactics," Reed said reassuringly. "Our job is to make sure the court sees the truth, but we'll need your help. We'll need you to testify." Claire's stomach churned at the thought of facing Jeremy in court, but she knew there was no other choice. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. As she hung up the phone, Claire looked at Emily, who was playing quietly with Maria's boys. A sense of resolve washed over her. Jeremy might have controlled her for years, but she wouldn't let him take Emily. Not now. Not ever. The battle for truth. The courthouse was an imposing structure, its gray stone facade seeming to loom over Claire as she stepped out of the car. Detective Reed had accompanied her, offering moral support and a steady presence. Claire clutched Emily's hand tightly as they approached the entrance. The little girl looked up at her mother, sensing her nervousness but saying nothing. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Jeremy Watson was already there, seated at the defendant's table with his high-powered attorney, Jonathan Price. Price was a seasoned litigator, known for his ability to twist narratives and create doubt where none should exist. His reputation was as intimidating as his sharp, tailored suits. Claire took a seat at the plaintiff's table, her attorney, Sarah Langford, beside her. Sarah was a young but passionate lawyer with a reputation for fighting fiercely for victims of abuse. She placed a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. "We've got this," she said softly. "Just stick to the truth." Across the room, Jeremy's cold gaze locked onto Claire. His expression was unreadable, but the smirk that tugged at the corners of his mouth sent a chill down her spine. Claire looked away, focusing instead on Emily, who sat quietly with a social worker at a nearby bench. The opening shots. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, entered the courtroom, and the proceedings began. Price wasted no time launching his attack. He painted Claire as an unstable woman, overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and prone to overreacting. He produced doctored text messages and emails, twisting their contents to suggest Claire was erratic and manipulative. "Your Honor," Price said, his voice smooth and commanding, "this is not a case of abuse. This is a case of a disgruntled spouse using the court system to punish my client. Jeremy Watson is a loving father who only wants what's best for his daughter." Claire's fists clenched under the table, her body trembling with frustration. But Sarah was prepared. When it was her turn, she presented a starkly different narrative, one supported by evidence and testimony. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice firm, This case is about a man who has used fear and manipulation to control his family. We will show that Jeremy Watson is not the loving father he claims to be, but a man who poses a danger to both his wife and his child. Claire's testimony. When Claire took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah guided her through her testimony, asking questions designed to draw out the truth. Mrs. Watson. Sarah began, "Can you describe your relationship with Mr. Watson?" Claire hesitated, her eyes darting toward Jeremy. But then she looked at Emily, sitting quietly with her bunny, and found her courage. At first, it was perfect, she said, her voice trembling. He was charming, attentive. He made me feel special. And when did that change? Sarah asked. Claire swallowed hard. After Emily was born, he started getting angry. Little things would set him off. If dinner wasn't ready on time, if I spent too much money on groceries, he would yell, throw things. Sometimes he'd hurt me. Did he ever hurt Emily? Sarah's voice was gentle but probing. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she nodded. Yes, he'd grab her arm too hard, yell at her for crying. She was just a baby. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Claire's words settling heavily over everyone present. But Price was quick to pounce during cross-examination. Mrs. Watson, he began, his tone dripping with skepticism. You claim my client was abusive, yet you stayed in the marriage for years. Can you explain why? Claire bristled, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. Because I was scared, she said, her voice stronger now. Jeremy made me feel like I had no choice. He said no one would believe me, that I'd lose Emily if I tried to leave. Price smirked, pacing in front of her. Scared, yet you managed to call 911. Convenient timing, don't you think? Claire's face burned with anger, but she held her ground. I called because I couldn't take it anymore, because he grabbed Emily, and I knew if I didn't do something, it would only get worse. The detective's evidence. Detective Reed was the next to testify, and her calm, authoritative demeanor was a stark contrast to Price's aggressive tactics. She presented photos of the bruises on Claire's wrist and Emily's arm, as well as reports from the night of the 911 call. We responded to a distress call from Mrs. Watson, Reed said. When we arrived, she and her daughter were visibly shaken. There were signs of physical harm, and Mrs. Watson's account was consistent with the evidence we found. Price attempted to discredit her, suggesting the injuries could have been self-inflicted or exaggerated. But Reed remained unflappable. I've worked on dozens of domestic abuse cases, she said firmly. This was not an overreaction. This was a mother trying to protect her child. Jeremy's defense. When Jeremy took the stand, he played the role of the wronged father perfectly. He spoke of his love for Emily, his desire to provide her with a stable home, and his disappointment in Claire's unpredictable behavior. I've always tried to be a good husband and father, Jeremy said, his voice steady and measured. I don't know why Claire is doing this. I just want what's best for our daughter. But Sarah was ready. She presented financial records showing Jeremy's unexplained withdrawals and highlighted his history of workplace complaints. She painted a picture of a man who was not only controlling but dangerous. Mr. Watson, Sarah said during cross-examination, can you explain why your former coworker filed a harassment complaint against you? Jeremy stiffened, his polished facade cracking slightly. That was a misunderstanding, he said dismissively. It was resolved. Resolved, or silenced. Sarah pressed, because it seems like a pattern, intimidating those who challenge you. Jeremy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A mother's resolve. As the trial stretched on, Claire's resolve grew stronger. She spoke openly about her experiences, refusing to let Jeremy's manipulations silence her. She described the nights she spent hiding bruises, the lies she told to protect Emily, and the moment she realized she had to fight back. I stayed quiet for too long, Claire said during closing arguments, but I'm not quiet anymore. I won't let him hurt us again. The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the strength it took to stand up to someone like Jeremy. Cracks in the facade. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial entered its fourth day. Jeremy Watson's previously unshakable confidence was beginning to show signs of strain. His polished appearance, a tailored suit and immaculately combed hair, was betrayed by the nervous tapping of his fingers on the defense table. The weight of the evidence presented so far had chipped away at the walls of his carefully constructed persona. At the plaintiff's table, Claire sat with her attorney, Sarah Langford, a sense of quiet determination radiating from her. She had spent years cowering in the shadow of Jeremy's control, but now, as the pieces of his facade began to crumble, she felt a newfound strength. Her focus was no longer on the man she had feared, but on the little girl who was counting on her. Emily sat quietly in the gallery with a social worker, her bunny clutched tightly to her chest. She was too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but her presence was a reminder to everyone in the room of what was truly at stake. A key witness emerges. The prosecution called their next witness, Jeremy's former coworker, Melissa Carter. Melissa was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had worked with Jeremy at a financial consulting firm several years ago and had filed a harassment complaint against him, a complaint that had mysteriously disappeared. As Melissa took the stand, Jeremy's demeanor shifted. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightening as he shot her a cold, warning glance. Melissa, however, met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "Ms. Carter," Sarah began, "can you describe your professional relationship with Mr. Watson?" Melissa nodded. "We worked together for about 3 years. At first, he was polite and professional, but over time, his behavior changed. He became controlling, manipulative. He had a way of making you feel like you couldn't say no to him." "Did you ever feel threatened by Mr. Watson?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Melissa said firmly. "He would make comments about how he could ruin someone's career if they crossed him. He wasn't shy about reminding people of his connections." "And did you file a complaint against him?" Sarah continued. "I did," Melissa replied. "After an incident where he cornered me in my office and berated me for questioning his methods. I felt unsafe, and I knew I had to report it." Sarah nodded. "What happened after you filed the complaint?" Melissa's expression darkened. "The complaint disappeared. I was told it had been resolved, but no one ever spoke to me about it. A few weeks later, I was reassigned to another department, and Jeremy acted like nothing had happened." "Thank you, Miss Carter," Sarah said. "No further questions." The defense strikes back. Jonathan Price rose from his seat, his expression calm and confident. He approached Melissa with an air of practiced charm. "Ms. Carter," he began, "isn't it true that you and Mr. Watson clashed over a project that ultimately led to your reassignment?" Melissa frowned. "We had disagreements, yes, but—" Price cut her off, his tone sharper now. "And isn't it also true that your department was underperforming at the time, which may have contributed to your reassignment?" Melissa's jaw tightened. "That's not why I was reassigned." Price smiled faintly, as though he had already won the point. "Of course. No further questions." As Melissa stepped down, Claire clenched her fists under the table. She could see the defense's strategy clearly: discredit, deflect, and deny. But Sarah wasn't deterred. She had saved her most compelling evidence for last: the digital trail. The prosecution's final witness was Detective Anna Reed, who had been leading the investigation into Jeremy's financial dealings. Reed approached the stand with a folder of documents and a confident stride. "Detective Reed," Sarah began, "can you explain the nature of your investigation into Mr. Watson?" Reed nodded. "We examined Mr. Watson's financial records and discovered several large, unexplained cash withdrawals over the past 5 years. These withdrawals coincided with significant events in his personal life, including the relocation of his wife and daughter to a new home and his wife's temporary hospitalization." "Did you find any evidence of financial misconduct?" Sarah asked. Yes, Reed replied. We discovered that Mr. Watson had been funneling money through a shell corporation to hide personal expenses. Additionally, we found evidence of payments made to individuals who later withdrew complaints against him. The courtroom murmured in response, and Sarah let the moment hang in the air before continuing. Detective Reed, is there any indication that Mr. Watson used these funds to intimidate or silence individuals? Reed's expression hardened. Yes. Based on the transactions we traced, it's clear that Mr. Watson used these funds to maintain control over those around him, including his wife. Sarah turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these financial records into evidence. The judge nodded, and Sarah handed the documents to the court clerk. At the defense table, Jeremy's confident facade cracked further. He leaned toward Price, whispering urgently, but his attorney simply shook his head. The turning point. As the prosecution rested its case, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had built a strong case against Jeremy, but the outcome was far from certain. Price's cross-examinations had sown seeds of doubt, and Jeremy's calm demeanor might still sway the jury. In her closing arguments, Sarah spoke directly to the jury. This case is not just about financial misconduct or workplace intimidation, she said. It's about a man who used fear as a weapon against his own family. It's about a mother who found the courage to stand up and say, "No more." Jeremy Watson has spent years manipulating those around him. But today, the truth has been laid bare. Emily deserves a safe, loving home, and Claire deserves justice. When Price delivered his closing arguments, he tried to cast Jeremy as a victim of a bitter, vengeful spouse. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, my client is not a perfect man, but he is a devoted father. Don't let unproven accusations and emotional testimonies cloud your judgment. A mother's resolve. As the jury deliberated, Claire sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands trembling despite Sarah's reassurances. Emily sat beside her, drawing on a notepad the social worker had given her. She looked up at her mother and smiled, a small, innocent gesture that brought tears to Claire's eyes. I'm doing this for you, Claire whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. No matter what happens, I'll keep fighting for you. After several hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood and read the decision. Claire held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson stood, a single sheet of paper in hand. Every creak of a chair, every whispered breath seemed amplified in the tension-filled room. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched Sarah's hand under the table. Across the room, Jeremy sat with his attorney, Jonathan Price, his expression unreadable but his body rigid with tension. The judge adjusted her glasses, her gaze steady as she addressed the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreperson replied, her voice steady, but tinged with the weight of responsibility. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded the paper and cleared her throat. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant, Jeremy Watson, guilty. On the charge of domestic abuse, we find the defendant, Jeremy Watson, guilty. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the words sank in. Claire let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks as relief and disbelief washed over her. Emily, too young to fully grasp the significance, looked up at her mother and smiled, sensing her joy. Jeremy's calm facade finally cracked. His jaw tightened and his fists clenched on the table. He turned to Price, who leaned in and whispered something. Whatever reassurance his lawyer tried to offer did little to soothe him. The judge's sentencing. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order in the courtroom as murmurs filled the air. Mr. Watson, she said, her tone firm and unyielding, this court has heard overwhelming evidence of your abusive behavior and your actions to manipulate and control those around you. Your crimes are not just legal violations but moral failures of the highest order. Jeremy stared ahead, his jaw set and his expression defiant, though his eyes betrayed flickers of fear. It is the decision of this court to sentence you to 10 years in state prison for the charge of child endangerment and an additional 5 years for domestic abuse, to be served consecutively. You will also be required to participate in rehabilitation programs for anger management and abuse prevention while incarcerated. Furthermore, you will have no contact with your daughter, Emily Watson, until a licensed counselor deems it safe for her. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, but Claire barely heard them. Her focus was on the words, "No contact with Emily." It was what she had hoped for, what she had prayed for. Jeremy shot to his feet, his composure gone. "This is a joke," he shouted. "I'm her father. You can't keep me away from her." The judge banged her gavel again. "Mr. Watson, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Jeremy's lawyer pulled him back into his seat, but his glare toward Claire burned with unspoken threats. For the first time, however, Claire didn't look away. She met his gaze, her expression steady and unyielding. A new beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing and their questions shouted over one another. Sarah shielded Claire and Emily as they made their way to the waiting car. The social worker, Miss Jenkins, held Emily's hand, gently guiding her through the chaos. "How do you feel, Mrs. Watson?" one reporter shouted. "Do you think justice was served?" another called out. Claire paused for a moment, turning to face the cameras. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "I'm grateful for the verdict," she said, "but this is just the beginning. There are so many women and children out there who don't get their voices heard. I hope this case shows them that it's never too late to fight for what's right." Her words were met with a flurry of camera flashes and murmured commentary as she turned back to the car. Once inside, the noise faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Sarah turned to Claire, a small smile on her face. "You did it. You stood up to him." Claire nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I couldn't have done it without you." Building a safe haven. Over the next few months, Claire and Emily began to rebuild their lives. With the help of Sarah and Miss Jenkins, Claire found a modest but comfortable apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a place where they could finally feel safe. Emily started kindergarten, her bubbly personality slowly returning as she made new friends. Claire found work at a local community center, helping other women navigate the challenges of leaving abusive relationships. It was both healing and empowering, giving her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Claire was tucking Emily into bed, the little girl looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, is Daddy coming back?" Claire's heart ached at the question, but she stroked Emily's hair and smiled softly. "No, sweetheart, Daddy won't be coming back. But we're going to be okay. I promise." Emily nodded, her small hand clutching her bunny. "I like it here, Mommy. It feels happy." Claire kissed her forehead, tears welling in her eyes. "Me too, baby. Me too." A voice for the voiceless. As time passed, Claire became more involved in advocacy work, sharing her story at local events and supporting legislation aimed at protecting victims of domestic abuse. Her courage inspired others to come forward, creating a ripple effect in the community. At one such event, Claire stood before a room full of people, her voice steady as she recounted her journey. "For years, I believed I had no choice, that I was trapped. But I've learned that there is always a way out. It's not easy, and it's not without fear, but it's worth it. For yourself, for your children, for your future." The room erupted in applause, and Claire felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And she was determined to help others do the same. Jeremy's fall from grace. Meanwhile, Jeremy's life unraveled behind bars. Stripped of his power and control, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His once sterling reputation was shattered, his name synonymous with disgrace. Reports from the prison indicated that Jeremy struggled to adapt, his attempts to intimidate other inmates quickly thwarted by the harsh realities of his new environment. He was no longer the one in control, and the loss of power was a punishment in itself. A future full of hope. Years later, Claire stood in the backyard of their small home, watching Emily chase fireflies under the warm glow of the setting sun. The air was filled with laughter, a sound that had once felt like a distant memory, but now filled her heart with joy. As she leaned against the porch railing, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a national advocacy organization inviting her to speak at a conference. Claire smiled, her resolve strengthening. Her journey wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid of the path ahead. She turned her gaze back to Emily, who ran toward her with a jar of glowing fireflies. "Look, Mommy, I caught them." Claire knelt down, taking the jar and admiring its soft, golden light. "You did, sweetheart. They're beautiful." Emily grinned, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Just like us, right, Mommy?" Claire pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, her voice steady and full of love. "Yes, baby, just like us." A light in the darkness. 5 years had passed since Claire Watson took her first courageous step out of the shadows of fear. The years had not been easy, but they had been transformative. Claire had built a new life for herself and Emily, one filled with love, safety, and hope. Their once fractured world now felt whole, though the scars of their past still whispered their stories. On a cool autumn morning, Claire sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea as sunlight streamed through the window. Emily, now 10 years old, sat across from her face scrunched in concentration as she worked on a school project about inspirational figures. Her choice, her mom. "Mom," Emily asked, glancing up from her colorful poster board, "what does resilient mean?" Claire smiled softly, setting her mug down. "It means being strong, even when things are really hard. It's about not giving up, no matter what." Emily's eyes sparkled with understanding. "Then you're the most resilient person I know," she said matter-of-factly, her voice filled with admiration. Claire's heart swelled with emotion. She reached across the table, brushing a strand of Emily's golden hair behind her ear. "And you're the reason I'm strong," she said, her voice thick with love. A ripple effect. Claire's work in advocacy had grown into a movement. What started as speaking at local events had blossomed into a nonprofit organization called Safe Horizons, which focused on helping survivors of domestic abuse rebuild their lives. The organization provided resources like emergency housing, legal assistance, and counseling, and it hosted educational workshops to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse. On this particular day, Claire was preparing for one of the most significant events of her career, a keynote speech at a national conference on domestic violence prevention. Her journey from victim to advocate had drawn national attention, and her story was inspiring others to take action. As Claire packed her materials for the conference, she felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She knew the importance of her voice in the fight against abuse, and she was determined to make every word count. The conference hall was filled with hundreds of attendees, from survivors to social workers to lawmakers. Claire stood backstage, taking deep breaths as she prepared to share her story. She glanced at her note cards, but knew she wouldn't need them. This was her truth, and she had lived every word of it. When her name was announced, the room erupted into applause. Claire stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. For a moment, the enormity of the moment overwhelmed her, but then she saw Emily sitting in the front row, her eyes wide with pride. That was all the reassurance she needed. Claire began to speak, her voice steady and clear. She recounted her journey, the years of silence, the night she made the 911 call, the trial, and the aftermath. She spoke of the fear she had felt, the courage it had taken to leave, and the healing she had found through helping others. "But this isn't just my story," Claire said, her voice resonating with conviction. "It's the story of countless women and children who are still trapped in silence, who still believe there's no way out. It's for them that I stand here today, to say that there is hope. There is a way out, and there is a life beyond the pain." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, as Claire finished, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Tears streamed down her face as she looked out at the crowd, knowing that her voice had made a difference, an unexpected ally. After the conference, Claire mingled with attendees, answering questions and listening to their stories. Among them was a man in his late 50s with a kind but weary expression. He introduced himself as Richard Palmer, a state legislator who had been moved by her speech. "Mrs. Watson," he began, his voice earnest, "your story is a powerful reminder of the gaps in our system. I want to work with you to push for stronger protections for survivors and more accountability for abusers." Claire was taken aback by his sincerity. Over the years, she had encountered plenty of people who paid lip service to the cause, but something about Richard's demeanor told her he was different. She extended her hand. "I'd be honored to help," she said. Their partnership marked the beginning of a legislative campaign to reform domestic violence laws. Together, they drafted proposals for stricter penalties for repeat offenders, mandatory training for law enforcement on handling domestic violence cases, and increased funding for shelters and support services. A reunion with the past. One day, as Claire was preparing for a workshop, she received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar but tentative. "Claire," the woman said softly. "It's Melissa Carter." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Melissa had been one of the key witnesses in Jeremy's trial, and though they hadn't spoken since, Claire had often thought of her. "Melissa," Claire said warmly, "it's so good to hear from you. How are you?" Melissa hesitated. "I'm better," she said. "I've been following your work, and I wanted to thank you. You gave me the courage to speak out, and it's changed my life." Claire felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "But you're the one who found your courage. I just gave you a nudge." Melissa chuckled softly. "Still, I wanted you to know. And if there's ever anything I can do to help with your work, please let me know." The conversation left Claire feeling more determined than ever. Every voice raised, every story shared, was a step toward breaking the cycle of abuse. Jeremy's shadow. Though Claire had moved forward, the shadow of Jeremy Watson still lingered. She occasionally received updates about his incarceration through the justice system. Jeremy had struggled to adapt to life behind bars, his attempts to manipulate and intimidate others falling flat in an environment where he held no power. One day, Claire received a letter from the prison. The sight of Jeremy's name on the envelope sent a shiver down her spine, but she chose not to open it. Instead, she handed it to her therapist, who agreed to review it and determine if it contained anything Claire needed to address. "You don't have to carry his weight anymore," her therapist said gently. "You're in control now." Claire nodded, her resolve strengthening. Jeremy no longer had power over her or Emily, and she was determined to keep it that way. A future full of light. Years later, Claire stood in the garden of her home, watching Emily, now a teenager, prepare for her high school's community service fair. Emily had inherited her mother's determination and compassion, channeling her energy into helping others. "Mom," Emily called, holding up a brochure she had designed for Safe Horizons. "What do you think?" Claire took the brochure, her eyes scanning the colorful design and heartfelt message. "It's perfect," she said, pulling Emily into a hug. "You're going to change so many lives." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Just like you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. Their journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had emerged stronger. Together, they had turned their pain into purpose, their fear into hope. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they'd no longer define them. They were a testament to their resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. A legacy of change, The cool evening air settled over Claire's home as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. She stood in the garden, her arms crossed as she watched Emily pack her project materials into a small bag. The teenager was vibrant, full of purpose, and brimming with the confidence Claire had once feared would be stifled by their past. Every laugh, every determined glance from her daughter, reminded Claire of why she had fought so hard. Inside the house, Claire's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen and saw an email notification from Richard Palmer's office. It confirmed the passage of the Safe Futures Act, the legislation she and Richard had worked tirelessly on for the past 2 years. The law expanded protections for survivors of domestic violence, increased funding for shelters, and mandated specialized training for law enforcement to handle abuse cases with care and empathy. Claire sank into a chair, her eyes welling with tears of gratitude. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had endured the pain she once carried alone. She sent a quick thank you reply to Richard, and then stepped outside to join Emily. A day of recognition. Months later, Claire stood in front of a crowd gathered at a city park for the dedication of a new domestic violence shelter named Lila's Haven after another survivor whose story had sparked national awareness years ago. The event brought together survivors, advocates, and community leaders to celebrate the opening of a facility that promised safety and hope to those in need. As Claire stepped up to the podium, she paused to take in the faces before her. Some were familiar from her years of advocacy work. Others were strangers whose eyes told stories of courage and struggle. Emily stood in the front row, her smile wide, and her eyes glistening with pride. Claire adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "This isn't just a building," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This is a symbol, a promise to those who feel trapped, unheard, or invisible. It's a testament to the power of resilience, to the strength it takes to break free and rebuild." She paused, her gaze drifting to Emily. "And it's a reminder that we're never truly alone. Together, we can create a world where no one has to endure what so many of us have. A world where every voice matters and every life is valued." The crowd erupted into applause as Claire stepped back, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She glanced at the shelter's entrance, its doors open wide, as if inviting a brighter future to step inside. Closure. In the days following the dedication, Claire received another letter from the prison where Jeremy was serving his sentence. This time, she decided to open it. The letter was short and handwritten, the once precise script shaky and uneven. The words were a mixture of apology and justification, an attempt to explain his actions while still refusing full accountability. Jeremy claimed he had changed, that he wanted to rebuild a connection with Emily someday. But as Claire read, she felt no anger, no fear, only pity. He was a man who had destroyed everything he touched, and now he was left with nothing but regret. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, choosing not to reply. Jeremy's chapter in their lives was over, and she would not let his words disrupt the peace she and Emily had worked so hard to build. A bright horizon. On a crisp spring morning, Claire stood at the edge of a scenic overlook, the wind gently tugging at her hair. Beside her, Emily adjusted the strap of her camera, capturing shots of the blooming wildflowers below. They had taken the weekend to hike and enjoy the outdoors, a tradition they had started a year after leaving their old life behind. As they walked along the trail, Emily turned to her mother, her voice filled with curiosity. "Mom, do you ever think about what our life would have been like if we hadn't left?" Claire paused, considering the question. "I do," she admitted. "And every time I think about it, I'm reminded of how grateful I am that we did. It wasn't easy, but it was the best decision I've ever made." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think you're the bravest person I know." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with love. "And I think you're the strongest person I know." They continued walking, the sun warming their faces as they laughed and talked. In that moment, Claire felt a profound sense of peace. The shadows of the past no longer held them captive. They had forged a future filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. Epilogue. A legacy of hope. Years later, Claire sat in a crowded auditorium, watching Emily cross the stage to receive her college diploma. The young woman had grown into a compassionate and driven individual, determined to make a difference in the world. Her degree in social work was the first step toward a career dedicated to helping others find their strength and voice. After the ceremony, Emily found Claire in the crowd, throwing her arms around her mother. "We did it, Mom," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Claire hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we did." In the years that followed, Emily became a prominent advocate for survivors of abuse, continuing the work her mother had started. Together, they built a legacy of change, proving that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, hope could flourish. And though the scars of their past would always remain, they were a testament to their resilience, a reminder that no matter how broken the world seemed, it was possible to rise, to heal, and to shine.